Years earlier, scientists at Gensis Laboratories created an experimental virus called ALZ-113 and began testing it on chimpanzees. Instead of producing the results they hoped for, the infected apes started displaying heightened intelligence along with violent and unpredictable behavior. Everything spiraled out of control after a deadly confrontation at the Golden Gate Bridge, where armed police clashed with the escaped apes. In the chaos that followed, the apes vanished into the wilderness, disappearing from human sight entirely. But the disaster didn't end there. The virus, later feared worldwide as the simian flu, accidentally spread to humans. What began as isolated infections soon evolved into a catastrophic global pandemic. Civilization collapsed piece by piece as billions died off, leaving humanity hanging on the edge of extinction. Years pass. Deep within the forests, the surviving chimpanzees have changed dramatically. They are no longer simply animals struggling to survive. The apes have evolved into an organized society with their own customs, communication, and sense of community. They hunt together in coordinated groups, share responsibilities, and care for one another like a true civilization. Leading them is Caesar, the respected and intelligent ruler of the ape colony. During one of their hunting expeditions, Caesar rides alongside his eldest son, Blue Eyes. After bringing down their prey successfully, the hunting party returns home on horseback carrying food for the tribe. Their settlement resembles a primitive but highly functional tribal community hidden deep in the woods. Young apes are taught how to read and write symbols and letters. Wooden homes and watchtowers have been built throughout the area. They create murals, forge hunting weapons, and even understand how to make fire. It's clear the apes are no longer surviving day to day, they are building a culture. When Caesar arrives back at the village, he sees his wife holding their newborn son. Proudly, he shares the moment with Blue Eyes, showing him his new little brother. Nearby, Morris, the wise orangutan who had earlier been teaching the younger apes, reflects with Caesar on how far their people have come. The conversation eventually turns toward humans. Morris gently asks Caesar whether he still thinks about them after all these years, knowing Caesar once shared a close bond with humans in the past. Caesar admits that he sometimes does. He quietly explains how different the two species are in his eyes. Humans destroy each other, while apes stay united as a family. Caesar wonders aloud whether mankind may have finally disappeared altogether. Morris replies that none of them have seen a human for over a decade. Not long after, two apes returning from a hunt unexpectedly encounter a man in the forest. Terrified by the sight before him, the stranger panics and points a gun at them. In his fear, he fires, injuring one of the apes. The gunshot echoes through the forest and immediately alarms the colony. Furious that one of their own has been attacked, the apes rush toward the scene. There they discover the frightened man isn't alone. He's accompanied by 6 other survivors. As the apes surround the group from every direction, tension fills the air. The humans realize they are completely outnumbered. Their leader, Malcolm, quickly insists that they never intended to hurt anyone. But as he stares at Caesar, he notices something deeply unsettling and strangely human in the ape leader's eyes. For several intense moments, nobody moves. Then Caesar finally breaks the silence, roaring a command for the humans to leave immediately. The apes aggressively drive the terrified group away. During the retreat, one frightened survivor accidentally drops a bag while running. Morris picks it up and hands it to Caesar. Suspicious of the humans' presence, Caesar orders Koba and 2 other apes to secretly follow them and discover where they came from. Meanwhile, Malcolm and his team return to an old quarantine checkpoint guarded by armed survivors. The settlement is overseen by Dreyfus, a hardened leader trying to keep the remaining humans alive. Malcolm quickly reports back about the hydroelectric dam they had been searching for. According to him, the structure is still operational enough to restore electricity to their settlement, but the mission uncovered something far more alarming. Malcolm explains that they encountered intelligent apes living in the forest. The revelation shocks Dreyfus, who immediately warns the group not to tell anyone. He fears news about evolved apes could trigger panic among the already fragile human survivors. Back inside the settlement, Malcolm's wife Ellie, once a doctor before civilization collapsed, explains that the remaining humans are alive because they possess a rare immunity to the simian flu. Without it, humanity would have disappeared completely years ago. At the same time, Caesar gathers the ape tribe to discuss the dangerous encounter. Many among them are furious and demand war after the humans spilled ape blood first. But Caesar refuses to rush into violence. He argues that war would destroy everything the apes have spent years building together. After the meeting ends, Koba approaches Caesar privately. Scarred physically and emotionally from years of human experimentation and abuse, Koba bitterly warns that humans cannot be trusted. He insists the apes should demonstrate their strength before humans become a larger threat. Caesar eventually decides to confront the humans directly. Mounting their horses, the ape army rides together toward the human settlement in a powerful display of force. When they arrive outside the city gates, panic spreads instantly among the survivors. Armed guards scramble into position while nervous civilians gather to witness the terrifying sight. Despite the fear, curiosity draws people closer as they stare at the massive ape tribe standing before them. Without hesitation, Caesar steps forward and delivers a clear warning. He tells the humans that the apes do not seek war, but they are fully prepared to fight if necessary. Before leaving, Caesar throws back the bag the humans lost in the forest and orders them never to return to ape territory again. The apes then ride away, leaving the settlement shaken and terrified. Fear quickly spreads among the survivors as everyone begins imagining what could happen if the apes attack. Trying to calm the growing unrest, Dreyfus gives a speech assuring the people that they will survive and eventually discover another energy source besides the dam. His words temporarily settle the crowd. But once the civilians disperse, Malcolm privately reminds Dreyfus that the dam is their only realistic chance to restore power and secure their future. Faced with desperation and dwindling options, Dreyfus grimly replies that if the apes stand in their way, then humanity may have no choice but to fight them. Dreyfus goes on to explain why the dam matters so much. Without electricity, the remaining survivors are completely isolated from the outside world. If they can restore power, they can reactivate long-range radio equipment and possibly contact other human communities that may still exist somewhere across the planet. Malcolm understands the urgency, but he also knows forcing their way through ape territory would only spark bloodshed. Wanting to avoid a war, he asks Dreyfus to give him 3 days to reason with Caesar peacefully. To convince him, Malcolm shows the bag Caesar returned earlier, arguing that no ordinary animal would make a gesture like that. Caesar is intelligent, thoughtful, and capable of understanding diplomacy. Dreyfus reluctantly agrees, but warns Malcolm that if negotiations fail, he'll be left with no option except harsher action. Determined to make things work, Malcolm prepares for the dangerous journey back into ape territory. He explains the situation to Ellie, and together with their son Alexander, Foster, Comp Carver, the same man who shot the ape earlier, and the rest of the crew, they head toward the forest. By the time they arrive, rain is pouring heavily over the woods. Malcolm cautiously tells everyone to remain inside the truck. If he doesn't return within 2 hours, they are to leave without him and head straight back to the settlement. Alone, Malcolm walks deeper into the ape territory until several hostile apes suddenly emerge from the darkness and seize him. They drag him through the forest toward the heart of their colony, where countless apes surround him from every direction. Knowing he has no chance of fighting back, Malcolm slowly raises both hands in surrender. Moments later, Caesar appears atop the tribe's central platform. The crowd quiets as the ape leader approaches. Malcolm immediately begs Caesar to hear him out, insisting he came peacefully and only wants to explain something important. Caesar silences the restless apes and agrees to listen. Soon after, Malcolm leads Caesar and several members of the tribe to the hydroelectric dam. Using gestures and broken explanations, Malcolm describes how the structure can restore electricity for the surviving humans. To his surprise, Caesar quickly understands the concept. He realizes the humans are trying to bring power back to their city. Malcolm carefully reassures Caesar that the humans do not intend to attack the apes. If they wanted violence, Malcolm points out, they could easily kill him right now instead of trusting him alone in the forest. After thinking it over, Caesar finally agrees to let them repair the dam, but under one strict condition. All firearms must be surrendered. Back at the ape village, Koba strongly opposes Caesar's decision. He warns that giving humans access to power will only make them dangerous again. Caesar calmly insists he's trying to build peace between the two species, not destroy it. Still consumed by hatred from years of torture in human laboratories, Koba angrily displays the scars covering his body as proof that humans are cruel by nature. But Caesar shuts him down immediately, making it clear that his decision stands. The next morning, Malcolm's group begins working on the dam while Caesar personally oversees the operation. Unknown to Caesar, however, Koba secretly leaves with 2 loyal followers and sneaks toward the human settlement. Once there, they quietly scout the area and discover a heavily guarded armory packed with weapons and ammunition. While exploring the building, Koba is suddenly spotted by 2 armed guards. Cornered with no escape, he instantly changes tactics. Pretending to be a mindless animal, Koba starts making clumsy movements and acting confused, fooling the men into believing he's nothing more than a harmless stray ape. The guards lower their weapons and laugh at him, allowing him to leave unharmed exactly as Koba intended. Meanwhile, work at the dam takes a dangerous turn when part of the structure suddenly collapses. Heavy debris crashes down, trapping Malcolm and injuring Carver's leg. Hearing the commotion, the apes rush to help. Working together with incredible strength, they remove the wreckage and rescue the trapped humans. Malcolm sincerely thanks Caesar for saving their lives, but because of the accident and Carver's injury, he asks if they can stay longer to finish the repairs. At that moment, Caesar's newborn son curiously wanders toward the humans. Everyone pauses in amazement as the baby ape innocently examines them, but the peaceful moment is shattered when the child uncovers a hidden shotgun among Carver's belongings. Instantly, the apes become aggressive. Panicking, Carver grabs the weapon and points it at the apes. Before he can react further, Caesar overpowers him effortlessly, ripping the shotgun from his hands and slamming him to the ground. Furious over the betrayal, Caesar nearly strikes Carver with the gun. Malcolm desperately begs him to stop before things spiral out of control. Caesar then turns the weapon toward Malcolm, reminding him that he explicitly forbade guns in ape territory. For a tense moment, it seems everything they built has collapsed, but instead of killing them, Caesar chooses mercy. He throws the shotgun into the river and orders the humans to leave immediately. As the group prepares to pack up, Malcolm refuses to give up. Hoping to repair Caesar's trust, he returns one final time to speak with him properly. Ellie follows alongside him. The apes escort them to Caesar's home, where Malcolm and Ellie discover that Caesar's wife is seriously ill. Ellie, still carrying her old medical instincts from before the collapse of civilization, offers medicine to help treat her. After some hesitation, Caesar accepts the help. Grateful for Ellie's compassion, Caesar allows the humans to stay one additional day and even orders his apes to assist them in finishing the repairs faster. Carver, however, is no longer trusted. He is expelled from the worksite and forced to remain behind in the truck. Not long afterward, Koba and his followers return to the ape colony and report what they discovered about the human weapons stockpile. Soon after, Koba storms toward the dam and violently attacks Alexander. Malcolm rushes forward, begging him to stop. Unexpectedly, Morris steps in and shields the humans from Koba's aggression. Then Caesar arrives. Koba immediately challenges Caesar's judgment, accusing him of betraying his own kind by siding with humans instead of apes. He argues that Caesar's trust is making the tribe vulnerable. The accusation enrages Caesar. He lunges at Koba and brutally beats him down in front of everyone. The fight is completely one-sided, with Koba unable to defend himself against Caesar's overwhelming strength. At one point, Caesar nearly strangles him to death. But just before crossing the line, he stops himself, remembering the sacred rule their society was built upon: apes do not kill apes. Broken and defeated, Koba slowly rises to his feet and apologizes to Caesar. Later that night, however, Koba secretly speaks with blue eyes. Quietly manipulating Caesar's son, Koba warns him that Caesar no longer trusts him anymore. He claims he only wants to protect Caesar, but fears Caesar's growing faith in humans may ultimately lead to his downfall. The next morning, Morris quietly visits Alexander near the worksite. Grateful for Morris stepping in during Koba's attack, Alexander offers him the book he had been reading. Morris accepts it with curiosity, and the two spend time together flipping through the pages. For a brief moment, the tension between humans and apes seems to disappear as they peacefully share stories and laughter over the book. But elsewhere, Koba is already putting darker plans into motion. He secretly returns to the human armory and once again encounters the same guards from before, now distracted and drinking together. Pretending to be harmless again, Koba fools them long enough to lower their guard. The instant they stop paying attention, Koba grabs a rifle, kills the men without hesitation, and escapes with the weapon. Back at the dam, Malcolm and his team finally complete the repairs to the generator. The massive structure roars back to life, marking the first real success humanity has had in years. Later that evening, Malcolm's group and Caesar stumble upon an abandoned gas station hidden in the forest. Inside the attached convenience store, they find old supplies and even manage to get music playing. For the first time, both humans and apes relax together without fear hanging over them. As the music echoes through the empty station, Malcolm tells Caesar that the work is finished and they'll soon return to the city. Caesar admits that he finally trusts Malcolm and his family. The two share a handshake, symbolizing a fragile but genuine peace between their species. Wanting to prove the humans kept their word, Caesar escorts them close enough to the city to witness the restored electricity for themselves. Lights flicker back on across the settlement, and hope begins returning to the survivors. But just as everything seems to be improving, Caesar notices something disturbing in the shadows. Koba is secretly sneaking through the settlement carrying a firearm. Before Caesar can react, Koba suddenly shoots him and disappears into the chaos. At the same moment, one of Koba's followers ignites fires throughout the ape colony, setting homes ablaze. Panic erupts instantly as flames spread across the village. Amid the confusion, Morris immediately understands what's happening. Realizing Koba has betrayed Caesar, he urgently tells Malcolm and the others to escape before the enraged apes blame them. Koba then seizes control of the situation. Climbing before the terrified tribe, he falsely accuses the humans of murdering Caesar and burning the village. Consumed by rage and grief, the apes believe him. Declaring himself their new leader, Koba rallies the tribe into preparing for war against humanity. Meanwhile, inside the now-powered human settlement, the survivors celebrate the return of electricity. For the first time in years, lights illuminate the city, and Dreyfus begins attempting radio contact with other possible survivor colonies across the world. Hope briefly spreads among the people. That hope vanishes almost immediately. Koba leads the apes in a surprise assault on the human armory, stealing massive amounts of weapons and ammunition. Once Dreyfus receives word of the attack, he quickly evacuates civilians, arms his remaining soldiers, and prepares the city defenses. Soon, through the heavy mist outside the city, the ape army appears riding forward on horseback like an unstoppable wave. Gunfire erupts as the apes begin attacking, forcing Dreyfus's men into cover. The humans retaliate fiercely, firing back with deadly accuracy. The battlefield descends into complete chaos as bullets tear through both sides. Apes fall from their horses, while soldiers are overwhelmed under the sheer force of the attack. Blue Eyes watches in horror as members of his own tribe are slaughtered around him. Then Koba charges directly into the middle of the battlefield. Mounting a horse and wielding rifles in both hands, he launches a savage counterattack almost single-handedly, cutting through the human defenses with terrifying aggression. Desperate to stop the assault, Dreyfus fires a rocket launcher, temporarily slowing the apes' advance. But the humans are badly outnumbered, and the apes continue forcing their way through the first defensive line. In a final attempt to turn the tide, a tank suddenly flanks the battlefield and opens fire on the apes, wiping out huge numbers of them. For a moment, it seems humanity may still survive the attack. But Koba notices the tank immediately. Using incredible agility and reckless determination, he manages to climb aboard and overpower the crew. Once the tank is neutralized, the ape army completely crushes the remaining defenders. From a distance, Dreyfus watches helplessly as his city falls apart before his eyes. Elsewhere in the forest, Malcolm and the others discover Caesar badly wounded and barely alive. They quickly carry him back to their truck. To everyone's shock, Caesar weakly reveals that it was not a human who shot him, it was an ape. Realizing the truth, Malcolm immediately drives Caesar away from the battlefield before Koba's forces can find them. At the same time, Koba's army hunts down fleeing humans throughout the city. One brave survivor tries to delay the pursuing apes so others can escape, but Koba violently knocks him down. Koba orders another ape to execute the helpless man. However, the ape hesitates, believing Caesar would never allow such cruelty. Enraged by the disobedience, Koba drags the ape upward and throws him over a railing to his death in front of everyone. The brutal act terrifies the other apes into silence, including Blue Eyes. Koba coldly declares that Caesar is gone and that he alone is their leader now. Under Koba's command, the apes capture the surviving humans and imprison them as slaves. He also sends search parties throughout the area to hunt down any remaining people hiding outside the city. Among the imprisoned crowd, Blue Eyes is shocked to discover Morris and several loyal apes locked in cages as well. Their loyalty to Caesar has made them enemies in Koba's eyes. Morris quietly warns Blue Eyes to stay alive and protect himself. Meanwhile, Malcolm brings Caesar to an abandoned city nearby, the same place Caesar once called home years earlier. Inside an old house, the group realizes Caesar had once lived there alongside a human family before the collapse of civilization. Knowing Caesar's injuries are severe, Malcolm tells Ellie he must return to the city to retrieve surgical supplies capable of saving him. Back inside the occupied settlement, Malcolm sneaks through the streets searching for medicine while trying to avoid Koba's patrols. He manages to recover the medical kit, but escaping proves far more dangerous. As he moves through the shadows, Malcolm suddenly encounters the silhouette of an armed ape aiming directly at him. For a tense moment, he thinks he's been caught. Then the ape steps forward, its Blue Eyes. After hearing that Caesar survived the shooting, Blue Eyes secretly helps Malcolm escape. Soon afterward, father and son reunite emotionally. Caesar tells Blue Eyes the truth about Koba's betrayal and how he manipulated the tribe into war. Later that night, while recovering from his wounds, Caesar reflects on everything that has happened. He realizes his own mistakes, his misplaced faith, his blindness toward Koba's hatred, and his belief that peace between humans and apes would come easily. Blue Eyes tells Caesar everything that has happened inside the occupied city. He explains that Morris and several loyal apes have been imprisoned for refusing to follow Koba, and he also reveals that Ash was killed during the takeover. Hearing this devastates Caesar, and he realizes Koba's rule has already pushed the tribe into darkness. Determined to stop him before things get even worse, Caesar decides they must return immediately. Blue Eyes promises to help however he can. The following day, Blue Eyes secretly comes up with a rescue plan to free the captured apes and humans. That night, he carefully lures the ape guards toward the prison bus where the captives are being held. Once the guards step inside, Morris and the imprisoned apes ambush them with overwhelming force. Together, they overpower the guards and break free. With Blue Eyes assisting from outside, the prisoners manage to release the remaining human captives as well. Meanwhile, back at the abandoned house, Caesar quietly wanders through the memories of his former life. Inside, he discovers an old camera containing footage from years ago. Sitting silently, he watches recordings of happier times spent with the human who once raised him like family. For a moment, Caesar is no longer a war leader, just someone remembering the life he lost. Malcolm eventually enters the room, and the two speak briefly while reflecting on everything that led them here. Their conversation is interrupted when Blue Eyes and the rescued survivors finally arrive. Blue Eyes urgently warns Caesar that Koba is preparing something catastrophic. Without wasting time, Caesar, Malcolm, and the others head back toward the settlement to stop him. As they move through the underground tunnels beneath the city, Malcolm unexpectedly encounters Dreyfus and the few soldiers he has left. Before separating from the apes, Malcolm directs Caesar toward another route leading straight to the tower above the settlement. Once alone with Dreyfus, Malcolm learns the humans have one final desperate strategy: destroy the tower completely. Dreyfus believes bringing the structure down is the only way to stop the apes. But to make it work, he needs Malcolm's help. Malcolm struggles with the decision. After a long pause, he subtly grabs a nearby rifle and turns it toward Dreyfus's group, insisting they should give Caesar a chance to end things peacefully. At the top of the tower, Caesar and his followers finally confront Koba and his loyalists. The two former brothers face each other in silence before exchanging bitter words. Their ideologies clash openly, Caesar accusing Koba of betraying the tribe, while Koba mocks Caesar's weakness and trust in humans. The argument quickly erupts into violence. Koba attacks first with savage aggression, throwing powerful punches that send both of them crashing through the structure. They slam into metal beams and platforms before climbing back to their feet. Koba keeps pressing the assault relentlessly, landing heavy blows on Caesar until they both tumble again alongside falling debris. Even after the brutal fall, Caesar forces himself upright while Koba struggles through injuries from the impact. Below them, Malcolm desperately continues trying to delay Dreyfus and convince him not to trigger the explosives. Back on the collapsing tower, the fight intensifies. Koba grabs a metal rod and violently swings at Caesar, while Caesar focuses on dodging and defending himself across unstable platforms high above the city. The chase finally slows when Caesar tears loose a metal stairpiece and uses it as a shield against Koba's attacks. During the confrontation, Caesar bitterly tells Koba that he once trusted him like family. Koba snarls back that everything he has done was for the survival of apes, but Caesar sees through him now. He tells Koba the truth, that this war was never about protecting apes at all. Koba only ever fought for himself. The accusation drives Koba into a blind rage. He launches attack after attack recklessly until his injuries begin slowing him down. Seeing the opening, Caesar strikes directly at Koba's wound and finally begins turning the fight around. Now on the offensive, Caesar batters Koba backward across the collapsing structure. Even beaten and exhausted, Koba refuses to stay down and continues fighting desperately. Meanwhile, Malcolm keeps trying to stall for time, but Dreyfus finally creates an opening and lunges for the detonator. Holding it tightly, Dreyfus pauses and quietly tells Malcolm that everything he's doing is to save humanity. Then he activates the explosives. A massive explosion rips through the tower's foundation. Malcolm narrowly survives by leaping onto a safe section beside the rail tracks as the blast tears through the structure. The explosion interrupts the fight between Caesar and Koba, and the entire tower begins collapsing around them. Huge sections crumble apart, sending apes falling to their deaths amid the chaos. Despite the destruction, Caesar and several others survive the collapse. Koba survives too. Desperate and wounded, he grabs a gun from one of the dying apes nearby. In a final act of hatred, Koba opens fire toward Caesar and the apes trying to rescue the injured. One of the shots strikes Morris. Seeing Morris wounded pushes Caesar into pure fury. He launches himself at Koba and slams him backward onto the edge of the ruined tower, where Koba barely manages to cling onto a broken platform hanging over open air. Caesar slowly approaches him. Terrified and begging for survival, Koba reminds Caesar of the sacred law they once lived by: apes do not kill apes. For a moment, it seems Caesar intends to save him. He grabs Koba's arm and begins pulling him upward, but then Caesar looks back at the destruction around him, the dead, the wounded, and everything Koba has destroyed, and Caesar finally understands something painful. Koba stopped being one of them long ago. Without another word, Caesar releases his grip. Koba screams as he falls from the tower to his death below. After the battle, Caesar gathers the surviving apes within the ruined settlement. Nearby, he notices several apes dragging Malcolm out from the subway tunnels. Caesar immediately orders them to let him go. Malcolm warns Caesar that more human soldiers are coming and that the apes are no longer safe there. He urges Caesar and the tribe to leave before another war begins. Caesar sadly admits that the apes made terrible choices and that the conflict has already gone too far. Humanity will never simply forgive what happened. The war has already begun. He tells Malcolm to leave before more fighting arrives. The two quietly exchange a final moment of understanding and respect before Malcolm slowly walks away. Soon after, Caesar reunites with Blue Eyes and the rest of his family. One by one, the surviving apes gather around him and bow in recognition of their true leader returning. As dawn rises over the ruined city, Caesar stands silently facing the sunrise, fully aware that an even greater storm is approaching. When Rise of the Planet of the Apes first arrived, I don't think many people expected it to resonate as deeply as it ultimately did. On paper, it sounded dangerously close to the kind of studio reboot audiences tend to dismiss before release. Another Planet of the Apes film. That skepticism was real, especially after Planet of the Apes left many viewers uncertain about where the franchise could realistically go next. But Rise surprised people. Not because it radically reinvented cinema, but because it approached its characters with genuine emotional investment, especially Caesar. By the end of that film, the connection audiences formed with him felt unexpectedly powerful. Suddenly, this wasn't simply a science fiction spectacle anymore. It became the story of an intelligent, emotionally fractured figure gradually realizing he no longer belonged to either world. Naturally, expectations surrounding Dawn of the Planet of the Apes became significantly higher, and historically, that's often where franchises begin losing some of what made them compelling in the first place. Bigger budgets arrive. Larger action sequences, louder marketing campaigns, and somewhere along the way, the emotional core starts fading beneath the scale. What surprised me most about Dawn is that it moves in the opposite direction. The film almost seems uninterested in functioning as a conventional blockbuster at times. It's quieter than expected, more patient, more emotionally uneasy. From the opening moments, there's already a lingering sense that the world has fundamentally changed while no one was paying attention. Humanity is no longer thriving, it's enduring, barely, and Caesar is no longer simply an experiment that spiraled beyond control. He's a leader now, a father, the central figure of an emerging civilization forming deep within the forests. That shift in perspective is probably the sequel's smartest creative decision, because while Rise focused on the birth of intelligence and freedom, Dawn becomes something heavier. It asks what happens after revolution. What happens once ideals collide with fear, survival, political tension, and the pursuit of power? That's a far more complex film to construct, and you can feel the weight of that almost immediately. Even the tone evolves. The first film certainly carried emotional depth, but there was still a sense of discovery running through it. Dawn feels colder, more exhausted. There's a quiet sadness hanging over nearly every frame. The opening alone establishes that humanity effectively lost, while Caesar's people evolved beyond the shadows. From that point forward, the film builds a tension that never completely disappears. What I appreciate is that the sequel never relies excessively on nostalgia for the earlier entries in the franchise. There's respect for those films, absolutely, but Dawn isn't dependent on references or callbacks to justify itself. It genuinely wants to stand on its own as a serious science fiction drama. And honestly, that confidence elevates the film considerably. You can feel Matt Reeves approaching this material with far more gravity than many directors likely would have. The film trusts silence, it trusts atmosphere, it trusts facial expression and body language. There are sequences where almost nothing is spoken, yet the emotional tension between characters, particularly among the apes, feels completely clear. That was another major concern leading into the film, by the way, whether the visual effects would continue carrying emotional authenticity. In Rise, audiences connected with Caesar largely because Andy Serkis delivered such a remarkably human performance through motion capture. If Dawn failed to preserve that emotional clarity, the entire film probably would have collapsed under its own ambition. And somehow, rather than plateauing, the visual effects became even more convincing. There are moments throughout this film where the apes feel more emotionally alive than many of the human characters standing beside them, which sounds absurd until you actually experience it. I also think people sometimes forget how risky this sequel really was tonally. This could have very easily devolved into simplistic apes versus humans spectacle with large-scale action sequences every few minutes. Instead, the film deliberately slows itself down and focuses on mistrust, communication, fear, and the terrifying possibility that both sides may genuinely desire peace while still drifting toward conflict anyway. That's not standard blockbuster storytelling, and to be fair, not every aspect functions perfectly. Some of the human characters aren't developed as deeply as they probably should have been, and there are moments where the screenplay pushes the conflict forward a little too conveniently. But early on, before the full collapse into chaos, there's this fascinating sense that the film is reaching toward something larger than survival alone, not in an overly preachy way either, more observational than ideological. It quietly raises the question of whether intelligent societies are destined to repeat the same destructive cycles regardless of who inherits power. That's what immediately drew me back into the film while revisiting it, not the action. Not even the scale. It was realizing that Dawn of the Planet of the Apes wasn't simply attempting to surpass Rise. It was attempting to evolve it. One thing Dawn handles exceptionally well, almost immediately, actually, is the way it presents the apocalypse as something strangely quiet. Not the exaggerated kind of cinematic destruction where cities explode every few seconds. I mean the unsettling silence that comes after civilization has already collapsed and the world simply continues moving without us. The film opens with a montage showing the simian flu spreading across the globe. And honestly, after what audiences experienced during real-world pandemics years later, those opening moments carry a very different emotional weight now than they probably did in 2014. There's something deeply unsettling about how quickly humanity disappears in this universe. No alien invasion, no massive asteroid, no grand extinction spectacle, just illness, panic, societal collapse, and eventually emptiness. By the time the story truly begins, human civilization has become little more than a fading shadow of itself. What remains of San Francisco feels less like an active city and more like the lingering memory of one. The buildings still stand, but life inside them feels temporary. Electricity is gone, communication systems barely function, people survive through improvisation while trying to maintain the illusion that structure still exists. Meanwhile, deep within the forests, the apes are thriving. That contrast becomes one of the film's strongest pieces of world-building. The humans look exhausted, the apes look organized. You have this small human colony desperately attempting to restore a hydroelectric dam because electricity is no longer a convenience. It represents survival itself. Without power, they lose heat, communication, stability, and potentially whatever remaining hope exists of reconnecting with the outside world. So the mission to repair the dam feels grounded in something tangible and believable. It isn't some oversized science fiction artifact or abstract device. It's infrastructure, energy, civilization struggling to breathe again. The problem, of course, is that the dam sits directly within ape territory. And the film handles that setup remarkably well because neither side initially feels entirely wrong. The humans aren't entering the forest out of greed. They genuinely need the dam. But from Caesar's perspective, humans moving back into ape territory begins resembling the earliest stages of history repeating itself. That tension hangs over every interaction. Even before anyone openly discusses conflict, you can already feel how fragile the situation truly is. I also really admire how much time the film spends exploring ape society before the central conflict fully escalates. That was an incredibly smart, creative decision. It would have been easy to rush directly into large-scale action, but instead the film allows you to observe how the apes actually live. They hunt together, teach their children, protect one another, follow laws, ride through the forest on horseback like a fully functioning civilization. And strangely enough, their world feels more emotionally alive than the human one. That contrast is entirely intentional, obviously. Human civilization in Dawn feels like it's deteriorating physically and psychologically at the same time, while ape civilization is still expanding, still learning, still discovering its own identity. There's this deeply uncomfortable reversal happening beneath the surface of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes, where the humans increasingly resemble desperate survivalists, while the apes move steadily towards structure, governance, leadership, and culture. What makes the film especially effective is that it never aggressively underlines that idea. It simply allows the audience to sit with it and absorb the implications naturally. Even visually, the environments are constantly reinforcing that transition. San Francisco is overtaken by vegetation, abandoned vehicles, deteriorating buildings, and silent streets reclaimed by nature. And honestly, the production design deserves significantly more recognition because this world genuinely feels inhabited rather than digitally manufactured. There's texture everywhere: mud, rain, fractured concrete, rusting machinery, dim interiors operating on dwindling resources. The human survivors don't resemble polished dystopian heroes from a stylized young adult franchise. They look exhausted, unstable, like people who haven't experienced genuine security in years. Now, to be fair, if you start examining some of the logistics too closely, parts of the world building do become a little fragile. Several critics pointed that out at the time, and honestly, the criticism isn't entirely unfair. Questions naturally emerge. How are these survivors realistically sustaining themselves after a decade of collapse? Why remain inside the city rather than relocating somewhere more practical? What happened to larger military structures? How are supplies still functioning this long after civilization deteriorated? The film definitely smooths over some of those details, but truthfully, I think the atmosphere carries the material through most of the time. Even when the literal mechanics begin wobbling under scrutiny, the emotional reality of the world remains convincing, and that atmosphere becomes one of the film's greatest strengths. There's a lingering sadness hanging over nearly everything. Not melodramatic sadness, something quieter, more existential. It feels as though humanity already lost long before the story properly began. The surviving humans are desperately preserving fragments of a dying world, while the apes unknowingly construct the foundation of the next one. That idea alone gives the film an unusual kind of tension, because it no longer feels like a traditional war narrative. It feels like history itself quietly transferring from one species to another. What fascinated me most revisiting Dawn of the Planet of the Apes wasn't even the central conflict initially. It was realizing how fully the apes had evolved into a functioning civilization, while humanity deteriorated in the background. And the film wisely takes its time revealing that evolution. There's an extended stretch early in the forest where almost nothing feels rushed. You're simply observing the apes living, hunting together, communicating, teaching younger generations, organizing socially, riding through the woods in coordinated formations. And somehow none of it feels absurd, which honestly sounds almost impossible when described out loud. Because if you explain this premise poorly to someone, it could sound unintentionally ridiculous. It's about hyper-intelligent apes building a civilization outside San Francisco. That concept could have collapsed under its own ambition in countless ways, but the film approaches ape society with such sincerity and restraint that eventually your brain stops processing them as visual effects entirely. You begin recognizing distinct personalities, social dynamics, loyalties, and ideological differences. Certain apes carry themselves with calm authority, others project aggression, some observe quietly, some follow instinctively. It genuinely feels like an emerging culture rather than digitally rendered animals assembled for spectacle. And I think that's precisely where the sequel distinguishes itself from Rise of the Planet of the Apes. The first film centered on the awakening of intelligence. Dawn asks what intelligent beings actually do once freedom has already been achieved. The answer, apparently, is that they begin constructing society almost immediately. They establish laws, hierarchies, traditions, families, political divisions. That's where the film becomes especially interesting. The apes are no longer evolving purely biologically, they're evolving socially. And that evolution gradually becomes unsettling, because you realize they aren't merely inheriting human language or emotional depth. They're inheriting human behavior in its entirety. The admirable aspects and the destructive ones alike. Caesar stands at the center of all this like a ruler, attempting to preserve something fragile before internal contradictions tear it apart. You can feel the pressure weighing on him constantly. He's no longer the curious, emotionally conflicted ape from Rise. Now he carries responsibility, a family, a community, laws, history, expectations. There's an early sequence where the apes move through the forest together, and it almost feels mythological, like witnessing the birth of a dynasty or civilization in real time. The film gives them an extraordinary sense of dignity. Even their silence feels meaningful. That's another element the film handles remarkably well. The apes aren't constantly speaking. Much of their communication happens through posture, expression, movement, and tiny behavioral reactions. And honestly, those moments often become more emotionally expressive than some of the dialogue-heavy human scenes. The motion capture performances absolutely deserve recognition, but the restraint matters equally. The film understands when to remain quiet and simply allow behavior to carry emotional meaning. Because of that, the ape civilization feels emotionally believable, even if the speed of their evolution occasionally stretches realism. Which, to be fair, it absolutely does at times. Some viewers criticized how rapidly the apes advanced within roughly a decade. Suddenly, they've established structured communities, leadership systems, domesticated horses, improved communication, organized coordinated hunting groups, and begun functioning almost like an emerging nation. If you examine the timeline too literally, it's undeniably accelerated for dramatic effect. But strangely, I stopped caring about the realism fairly quickly because the emotional progression works so effectively. You believe Caesar would establish laws because of what he experienced among humans. You believe younger apes would view him with near-spiritual admiration. You believe someone like Koba would reject coexistence because every memory he carries of humanity is rooted in suffering. So even when the world-building moves faster than logic might comfortably allow, the psychological foundation underneath it remains grounded enough that the civilization itself begins feeling authentic. What's especially fascinating is how the apes gradually begin mirroring human society without fully recognizing it themselves. Political tension is already emerging internally. Ideological disagreements begin surfacing. Questions about leadership appear. Questions surrounding coexistence versus dominance quietly take shape. Even generational influence becomes visible through figures like Blue Eyes, and that's where the film becomes quietly tragic. Because Caesar genuinely believed the apes could become something better than humanity, more emotionally balanced, less destructive, more capable of restraint. But the larger their civilization grows, the more they begin inheriting the same flaws that ultimately destroyed human society in the first place. Fear, pride, tribal loyalty, anger, power struggles. The film almost treats civilization itself like an unavoidable cycle. Intelligence creates structure, structure creates politics, politics creates division. And suddenly these apes, who once symbolized liberation, begin feeling unsettlingly familiar. Even visually, the film reinforces that transformation constantly. The apes ride horses like mounted warriors. They gather around leaders, hold meetings, carry weapons, some even move with disciplined military precision. Yet simultaneously, they still retain a deeply physical animal energy in the way they move through trees or communicate non-verbally. That balance between primal instinct and emerging humanity is probably the film's most impressive achievement. They never feel entirely human, but they no longer feel like ordinary animals either. They exist in this eerie space somewhere between the two, and the film fully understands how unsettling that middle ground really is. And honestly, I think that's why the ape civilization becomes so compelling to watch. It isn't simply about apes replacing humanity. It's about watching history begin again beneath a different species, shaped by the same fears, the same ambitions, and ultimately, the same mistakes waiting patiently to repeat themselves. What truly makes Dawn of the Planet of the Apes work, and honestly what prevents this entire reboot trilogy from collapsing into just another effects-driven franchise, is Caesar. Everything revolves around him. Not in the conventional blockbuster sense, where the central figure simply happens to be the strongest or most capable person in the room. Caesar matters because emotionally, the entire film depends on whether you believe in him as a fully realized individual, or technically as an ape. But that's the remarkable thing after a while. You stop thinking about him as a CGI creation altogether. He simply becomes Caesar. And what I love about his portrayal in Dawn is how profoundly he has changed without the film constantly announcing those changes out loud. He feels older now, wearier. There's weight behind every decision he makes. In Rise of the Planet of the Apes, he was discovering intelligence, identity, and freedom. Here, he's carrying responsibility, and the film understands that leadership is exhausting, especially when you're trying to prevent two civilizations from destroying one another. The movie introduces him almost like a mythological figure at first. The apes follow him with absolute trust. Younger apes look at him with the reverence reserved for both kings and fathers. Even the way he moves through scenes feels measured and deliberate, calm, controlled. But underneath that control, you can constantly sense tension building inside him, because Caesar doesn't actually want war. And that distinction matters enormously. In a more conventional version of this story, Caesar probably becomes a revolutionary warrior, leading the apes into direct conflict against humanity. But Dawn chooses a far more emotionally interesting direction. Caesar remembers human kindness just as vividly as human cruelty. He remembers Will Rodman. He remembers compassion, care, connection. So unlike Koba, he cannot reduce humanity into monsters entirely. That internal conflict is what makes him so compelling. He's trying to preserve hope while surrounded by characters who increasingly view hope as weakness. And honestly, some of the film's strongest scenes are simply Caesar silently processing emotion and consequence. That sounds deceptively simple, but it's true. There are moments where Andy Serkis communicates more through posture, hesitation, and eye movement than many blockbuster protagonists manage through pages of dialogue. A brief glance toward Malcolm, a quiet interaction with his son, the hesitation before responding with violence. It all feels deeply human without ever losing the reality that he is still fundamentally an ape. That balance is honestly extraordinary when you stop and think about it. The film also smartly emphasizes Caesar as both a leader and a father because those two identities begin pulling him in opposite directions. As a father, he wants safety, stability, protection for his family, but as a leader, he's forced to think beyond personal emotion constantly. Every decision affects the future of ape civilization itself, and the pressure of that responsibility slowly begins wearing him down. You can feel Caesar realizing that leadership isn't about remaining morally pure at all times. It's about making impossible choices while understanding that someone will eventually resent you for them. The apes trust him, but fractures are already beginning to appear within his own society. Doubt, fear, anger. Koba's influence grows specifically because Caesar's commitment to peace starts looking fragile to apes traumatized by human cruelty. And Caesar understands that fear more than he wants to admit. That's what makes him tragic. He sees both sides too clearly. He understands why humans fear the apes. He understands why the apes distrust humans. And because he understands both perspectives simultaneously, he becomes emotionally isolated from nearly everyone around him. There's a quiet maturity to Caesar throughout this film that feels genuinely sad. He spends most of the story trying to prevent history from repeating itself, yet deep down, you increasingly sense that he already knows he may be losing that battle. What fascinates me most is that Caesar's greatest strength, empathy, slowly becomes his greatest vulnerability. He genuinely believes coexistence is possible. He believes trust can still exist between species. But the world surrounding him repeatedly rewards aggression more than understanding. And eventually, that realization starts breaking him emotionally. The film never turns Caesar into some flawless moral symbol either, which helps tremendously. He can be harsh, intimidating, furious. There are moments where you see instinct threatening to overpower restraint, but he constantly struggles to rise above those impulses because he sincerely wants the apes to become something better than humanity once was. That's the ideal he's trying to protect. The painful part is watching him slowly realize that intelligence alone does not erase violence. Yes, the apes are evolving, but they're also inheriting the same flaws humanity carried for generations. Pride, fear, tribalism, hunger for power. Caesar wants desperately to believe ape civilization can avoid repeating those mistakes, but Koba's rise forces him to confront the possibility that history may simply begin again under different rulers. And honestly, that realization gives the film enormous emotional weight. There's also this subtle loneliness surrounding Caesar throughout the story that I didn't fully appreciate the first time I watched it. He's surrounded by followers, allies, and family, yet leadership has emotionally separated him from everyone else. He's carrying knowledge no one else fully carries, the burden of understanding both species at once. That's why his scenes with Malcolm matter so much. Malcolm reminds Caesar of Will, of the possibility that goodness still survives somewhere within humanity, and Caesar desperately needs that to remain true because if it isn't, then Koba is right. And if Koba is right, peace was impossible from the beginning. That possibility terrifies Caesar more than conflict itself. And honestly, Andy Serkis deserves extraordinary credit because none of this works unless the performance feels emotionally authentic. The visual effects are remarkable, obviously, but Caesar feels real because Serkis gives him this incredible emotional intelligence. You can constantly see thoughts forming behind his eyes: regret, compassion, anger, exhaustion, disappointment. It never feels like technology attempting to impress the audience. It feels like a character enduring something deeply painful. By the end of the film, Caesar stops functioning as merely the protagonist. He becomes the emotional conscience of the entire story. Through him, the film continuously asks whether civilization truly learns from history or simply repeats it under new forms. And the heartbreaking part is that Caesar begins the movie believing the apes could become better than humanity. By the end, he's no longer certain. Koba is probably the moment where Dawn of the Planet of the Apes stops being simply an exceptionally well-made science fiction blockbuster and becomes something considerably darker. Because initially, Koba almost feels understandable in a way that catches you off guard, not sympathetic exactly, certainly not likable, but understandable. The film introduces him as this scarred, deeply hostile ape who distrusts humans immediately, and at first you naturally assume he exists to fill the familiar role of the aggressive antagonist, the volatile figure who pushes the narrative toward inevitable conflict because eventually the plot requires war. But the longer the film continues, the more unsettling Koba becomes because his hatred is rooted in something painfully real. He remembers what humans did to him, not abstractly, physically, emotionally. His body carries the scars of experimentation, captivity, and abuse. Every time he looks at humans, he isn't seeing diplomacy or coexistence. He's reliving cages, suffering, fear, humiliation. And the film very intelligently never asks the audience to erase that history. That's important because Koba would become a far weaker character if the movie treated him as inherently monstrous from the beginning. Instead, Dawn makes him tragic first. And honestly, that's precisely why he becomes frightening, because there comes a point where you completely understand why he believes peace is impossible. From Koba's perspective, Caesar's trust in humanity appears dangerously naive. Humans created the virus. Humans tortured apes. Humans built the world that nearly destroyed both species. Humans destroyed the world. Why would they suddenly become compassionate now? That's the terrifying core of Koba's worldview. And the unsettling part is that his logic isn't entirely irrational. It's absolutely poisoned by trauma, but it's still rooted in lived experience. That's what gives the character so much weight beyond simply functioning as the antagonist who creates conflict. His anger comes from somewhere tangible, and honestly, Toby Kebbell delivers an extraordinary performance here. It's one of those genuinely underrated performances that quietly carries enormous emotional complexity. There's this bitterness simmering underneath everything Koba says or does. Even in silence, you can feel resentment radiating from him. The way he moves feels entirely different from Caesar as well, less controlled, more erratic, emotionally unstable in subtle ways. Caesar carries the burden of leadership. Koba carries the burden of damage. And the film gradually reveals how trauma, when left unresolved, can evolve into ideology. That's what makes Koba's arc so fascinating. At first, he reacts emotionally to the presence of humans. But eventually he begins weaponizing those emotions politically. He understands fear. He understands anger. More importantly, he understands how easily wounded individuals can be manipulated once they've already decided someone deserves blame. There's that remarkable scene where Koba pretends to behave like a harmless, unintelligent animal around the humans, before suddenly revealing just how aware and dangerous he actually is. Honestly, it's one of the most unsettling moments in the entire film, not because it relies on shock value exactly, but because you realize Koba has fully learned how humans perceive him, and he's deliberately using that perception against them. That's the moment where he becomes genuinely dangerous, not merely physically, ideologically, because Koba no longer wants revenge alone. He wants dominance, control. He wants to guarantee that apes will never become victims again, even if achieving that requires turning them into aggressors themselves. And that's where the corruption truly begins. One of the saddest aspects of Koba's character is that he begins the film as living proof of human cruelty, but gradually becomes proof that cruelty reproduces itself. The abused become capable of becoming abusers. Violence teaches violence. Hatred mutates and survives across generations. The film never states this outright, but you feel it constantly. Koba hates humans so deeply that he slowly adopts many of the same qualities he despises in them: manipulation, militarization, betrayal, obsession with power. He ultimately breaks the central law of ape society: ape shall not kill ape, because vengeance eventually matters more to him than the ideals Caesar built their civilization around. And that betrayal lands with real emotional force because Caesar genuinely trusted him once. Early on, you can tell Caesar sees Koba almost like a brother, maybe not emotionally stable, but loyal, valuable, part of the family, which makes Koba's eventual descent feel less like a conventional villain reveal and more like watching unresolved suffering consume someone from the inside out. And honestly, the film becomes surprisingly political through him as well. Koba represents what happens when fear evolves into leadership, when trauma hardens into nationalism, when survival instincts escalate into extremism. He insists repeatedly that coexistence is weakness because he sincerely believes aggression is the only language humans truly understand. What makes that terrifying is that the film occasionally seems to validate his perspective. That ambiguity matters enormously. If the humans had been portrayed as cartoonishly cruel, Koba would never have worked nearly as well. But because the film depicts paranoia, aggression, and fear on both sides, his worldview begins making emotional sense even when his actions become horrifying. And the movie understands something deeply uncomfortable. Extremism often grows from pain people never learned how to heal from. Koba never heals, he adapts. There's a difference. The more influence he gains, the more ape civilization begins drifting toward the exact patterns that destroyed humanity: fear-driven leadership, internal division, militarization, suspicion. And suddenly Caesar's dream of building something better starts collapsing directly in front of him. That's what makes Koba such an effective antagonist. He isn't external to ape civilization, he's a product of it. Or more accurately, a product of what humanity did to it. He's essentially the living consequence of mankind's cruelty circling back around. And visually, the film reinforces that constantly. Koba's scars are impossible to ignore. His face almost always looks tense, shaped by anger, distrust, or buried resentment. Even compared to the other apes, he feels emotionally wounded in a way that never fully settles. Meanwhile, Caesar communicates through restraint. Koba communicates through escalation. Every scene becomes more volatile once he begins controlling the emotional direction of events. What's tragic is that Koba probably believes he's saving apekind. In his mind, peace only delays inevitable betrayal. He sees Caesar's empathy as weakness because empathy failed to protect him from suffering, so he chooses domination instead. And that's where the film quietly becomes heartbreaking. Because Koba and Caesar are both reacting to humanity. One responds with hope, the other responds with hatred. And Dawn of the Planet of the Apes keeps asking which response history tends to reward more often. One of the most interesting, and honestly somewhat ironic, aspects of Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is that for a movie technically centered around the survival of humanity, the human characters are often the least compelling part of it. Not poorly written necessarily, just overshadowed. And I honestly don't think that's accidental. The film clearly wants Caesar and ape society to carry the emotional center, so the human characters function more as different responses to fear, survival, and coexistence rather than dominant protagonists themselves. Some of them work better than others. Malcolm is probably the strongest human character because he feels like one of the few people genuinely attempting to prevent the world from collapsing further instead of accelerating that collapse through paranoia. Jason Clarke plays him with a restrained, grounded energy that I appreciated even more on rewatch. He's not trying to become some charismatic action hero. He looks exhausted, careful, like someone constantly calculating consequences because one wrong decision could get everyone around him destroyed. And honestly, that feels appropriate for this world. Malcolm's relationship with Caesar becomes incredibly important because it's one of the only connections in the film built on mutual observation instead of immediate hostility. They don't instantly trust each other, which would have felt artificial. There's caution embedded in every interaction, but there's also curiosity. Caesar sees traces of will in Malcolm, someone capable of empathy and understanding. Malcolm sees intelligence in Caesar that fundamentally challenges his understanding of the world. Those scenes are probably the closest the film comes to genuine hope. What I also appreciate is that Malcolm doesn't approach the apes like some morally enlightened figure who automatically understands everything. He's frightened too, everyone is, but he's willing to listen before resorting to violence, and in a film this emotionally tense, that alone makes him stand out. Ellie and Alexander reinforce that softer side of the human group as well. They aren't exceptionally layered characters, but they serve an important emotional function. Alexander especially matters because the film subtly suggests that younger generations adapt to the apes more naturally than adults do. Children aren't carrying decades of inherited fear and prejudice yet. It's a small detail, but it quietly says a lot. Then there's Dreyfus, played by Gary Oldman, and honestly, this is probably one of the film's few major missed opportunities. Because Oldman naturally brings gravity to almost everything he touches. Even with limited material, he still feels believable as a man trying to hold together the remains of civilization. The issue is that the screenplay never fully commits to exploring him deeply enough. He mostly functions as the pragmatic survivalist preparing for the worst-case scenario. And to be fair, from his perspective, that caution makes complete sense. Humanity is on the edge of extinction. An organized society of hyper-intelligent apes exists just beyond the city limits, and nobody truly knows whether peace between the two species is realistically sustainable. So while Dawn of the Planet of the Apes emotionally leans toward Caesar's perspective much of the time, I appreciate that it never fully transforms Dreyfus into some exaggerated villain figure. He's fearful, not irrational. And there's an important distinction between those two things. That balance helps the conflict feel tragic rather than simplistic because both sides have understandable reasons for their paranoia. Now Carver, on the other hand, is intentionally frustrating. He essentially embodies impulsive prejudice, the kind of person who enters an already unstable situation carrying anger, resentment, and a dangerously reactive mindset. And yes, some viewers criticized him for feeling slightly too engineered to push negotiations toward collapse. Honestly, that criticism is fair to a degree. There are moments where his behavior feels less like a fully layered human being and more like the screenplay physically steering events toward inevitable conflict. But at the same time, figures like Carver are absolutely believable in a societal collapse scenario. Fear makes people reckless, especially people grieving, traumatized, and searching desperately for someone to blame. And that's the recurring truth behind most of the human characters in this film. Nearly all of them are operating from fear first. Fear of extinction, fear of losing territory, fear of losing control. Fear that trusting the wrong person could erase whatever remains of humanity entirely. The film repeatedly shows how survival pressure gradually strips nuance away from people. That's probably part of why the apes sometimes feel emotionally richer than the humans. The humans are constantly reacting defensively, while ape society is still evolving philosophically, politically, and emotionally. The apes are changing. The humans are mostly trying not to vanish. And because of that, many of the human characters intentionally feel emotionally exhausted. Still, I do think the film might have benefited from giving the human side slightly more complexity overall. Outside of Malcolm, most of the humans become relatively easy to categorize. The pragmatic leader, the angry survivor, the compassionate medic, the hopeful child. Functionally, they work. But they don't always feel as layered as Caesar, Koba, or even Morris, which creates this fascinating dynamic where the CGI apes often feel more emotionally alive than the actual human characters. And honestly, when you stop and think about that, it's kind of incredible. There are scenes where Caesar communicates more internal conflict through a single expression than entire human conversations manage collectively. Part of that obviously comes from the remarkable motion capture performances, but part of it also comes from the screenplay simply investing more emotional energy into the apes themselves. The humans almost represent the old world at this point, exhausted, fragmented, defensive. Meanwhile, the apes represent a civilization still discovering what it wants to become. Naturally, that gives the ape characters more dramatic momentum. But even with their limitations, the human characters remain essential because they preserve the film's moral complexity. Without Malcolm, Caesar completely loses faith in humanity. Without Dreyfus, the humans stop feeling realistically desperate. Without Carver, the story loses that ugly side of fear-driven aggression that continually poisons every opportunity for peace. Each human character contributes to the larger tension differently. And what I appreciate most is that the film never fully argues that humans are uniquely corrupt while the apes are morally superior. Early on, it almost appears to lean in that direction. The apes seem more organized, more emotionally connected, perhaps even wiser. But as the story progresses, the film gradually reveals that both species carry the same instincts beneath the surface. Compassion, violence, tribal loyalty, fear. Humanity is simply further along in the cycle. That's what gives the conflict its sadness. Almost nobody initially wants total destruction. Most characters are reacting to trauma, survival pressure, or fear of losing their people. The tragedy is that once distrust begins spreading, even the most reasonable voices become increasingly powerless to stop what follows. And the humans, flawed as they are, become a major part of that collapse. What I think Dawn of the Planet of the Apes understands better than many war films is that wars rarely begin because everyone suddenly becomes monstrous overnight. More often, they begin because fear slowly contaminates every possible path away from violence, and that idea becomes the emotional engine driving the entire story. The central conflict here isn't really humans versus apes in the simplistic blockbuster sense. It's peace struggling against paranoia, trust struggling against survival instinct. Every major character is trying to answer the same fundamental question through different perspectives. Can these two species genuinely coexist, or is conflict inevitable regardless of how hard they try to avoid it? What makes the film especially compelling is that, early on, peace genuinely feels achievable. Fragile, absolutely, but achievable. That's important because the movie doesn't rush immediately into warfare. Tension exists from the beginning, but there's also this awkward, fragile effort from both sides to prevent catastrophe. Malcolm attempts negotiation. Caesar tries to keep his tribe calm, Even the humans, despite their fear, don't initially march into the forest seeking total destruction. Everyone is anxious. Everyone is suspicious. But for a while, people are still trying. And honestly, those early interactions become some of the most gripping sequences in the film precisely because they feel so delicate. One wrong movement and everything collapses. The movie constantly reminds you how unstable the situation already is. A weapon gets raised, someone panics, someone reacts emotionally. Suddenly, the possibility of peace begins fracturing. That's what makes the conflict feel tragic instead of purely thrilling. The humans need the dam because they're desperate. Without power, their society drifts even closer toward extinction. But from Caesar's perspective, allowing humans deeper access into ape territory risks exposing his people to the same species that once enslaved and experimented on them. And both perspectives make complete sense. That's the uncomfortable part. The film rarely offers the audience a morally uncomplicated side to support because survival itself keeps complicating morality. If humanity is disappearing, should humans prioritize their own survival above everything else? Probably, but if the apes finally achieved freedom after generations of suffering, why should they risk losing that freedom to help humanity rebuild power and influence again? There isn't an easy answer. And the movie draws enormous tension from the fact that the characters themselves don't fully know the answer either. Caesar wants peace because he remembers compassion from humans. Malcolm wants peace because he recognizes intelligence and emotional depth in the apes. But around them, fear spreads faster than trust ever can. That's the real danger. Fear becomes contagious in this film. The moment one side begins preparing for conflict, the other side immediately interprets that preparation as confirmation that conflict is already coming. And then that reaction becomes justification for further escalation. The film captures that cycle remarkably well. Nobody fully believes the opposing side will remain peaceful indefinitely, so everyone begins acting defensively, which inevitably starts looking aggressive. It becomes a self-fulfilling spiral. And Koba completely understands how to weaponize that fear. That's where the film transitions from tense diplomacy into outright tragedy. Because once Koba begins manipulating events from the shadows, the possibility of coexistence starts collapsing rapidly. What's interesting, though, is that the film never makes the war feel entirely artificial. Yes, there are moments where the screenplay nudges events forward a little too conveniently. But emotionally, the escalation still feels believable because the mistrust was already there waiting beneath the surface. The violence doesn't emerge from nowhere. It was sitting underneath every interaction from the very beginning. That's why even the quieter scenes in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes feel tense. Nobody is ever truly relaxed. Every conversation carries the sense that one wrong sentence, one emotional reaction, one moment of panic could push everything into catastrophe. And honestly, the film does an excellent job illustrating how moderate voices gradually lose influence during fear-driven conflict. Caesar and Malcolm are both trying desperately to hold things together, but increasingly, they are surrounded by individuals who interpret compromise as weakness. Koba sees peace as naive. Some humans view negotiation itself as dangerous. Once both societies begin fracturing internally, conflict becomes harder and harder to prevent, and that internal division matters enormously. Because the film isn't arguing that humans and apes are biologically destined for war, it's arguing that civilizations under pressure often create the conditions for conflict themselves. Pride, grief, revenge, insecurity, survival instinct, all of it feeds the situation until eventually nobody trusts anyone enough to step back anymore. And the tragic part is that several characters clearly understand war will destroy everything. Caesar knows it. Malcolm knows it. Even Dreyfus, beneath all the fear, probably understands it too. But once violence begins accelerating, nobody can fully control where it leads anymore. That helplessness gives the film an incredibly heavy emotional atmosphere. The closer the story moves toward open warfare, the less it feels like an action film triumph is waiting at the end. Instead, it starts feeling inevitable in the worst possible way, like watching two collapsing structures slowly drifting toward collision. I also appreciate that the film never romanticizes war once it finally erupts. The battles are visually impressive, obviously, but underneath the spectacle there's exhaustion and sadness embedded everywhere. The conflict never feels heroic. It feels like civilization failing in real time. And honestly, some of the film's strongest moments aren't even the battles themselves. It's the moments immediately before violence begins, the hesitation, the mistrust in people's expressions, the realization that peaceful coexistence may already be slipping beyond recovery. That emotional buildup matters far more than spectacle ever could, because at its core, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is really about how difficult peace becomes once societies begin defining themselves through fear. The apes fear returning to chains, humans fear extinction, and once survival enters the equation, morality becomes blurry remarkably quickly. That's why the film lingers with audiences afterward. Not because apes fighting humans is inherently groundbreaking, but because the emotional dynamics feel painfully recognizable. History is filled with conflicts that probably seemed avoidable at first too, until distrust became too large to contain. And by the end of the film, the truly heartbreaking realization is that peace probably was possible at one point. For a brief moment, both sides almost reached it. Almost. What really gives Dawn of the Planet of the Apes its emotional weight isn't the action itself. It's the feeling that everyone in the story is trapped inside fears they can't fully escape. That's the real antagonist here. Not humans, not apes, fear. Fear of losing power, fear of extinction, fear of trusting the wrong side, fear that peace itself may only be a temporary illusion before betrayal inevitably returns. The film keeps circling back to those emotions repeatedly, and honestly, that's why the conflict feels more unsettling than exhilarating much of the time. Because it feels familiar, the movie understands something deeply uncomfortable about intelligent societies. Once people begin viewing another group as fundamentally other, almost anything becomes easier to justify: suspicion, aggression. Violence, even extermination, starts sounding reasonable to certain individuals once fear expands far enough. And importantly, the film never pretends this mentality belongs exclusively to humanity. That's what makes it so compelling. At first, the apes almost appear morally superior. They're more organized, more emotionally connected, perhaps even less selfish. Human civilization destroyed itself while the apes built community deep within the forest. So naturally, there's a temptation to view the apes as the better species. But the longer the story unfolds, the more the film dismantles that assumption. The apes carry prejudice too. They carry fear too. And eventually, they carry tribalism as well. Koba becomes the clearest expression of that transformation, obviously, but honestly the mentality spreads beyond him. Once fear takes hold, it begins reshaping how the apes perceive humans entirely. Humans stop existing as individuals. They become a category, a threat, a species associated with pain, captivity, and suffering. And humanity does exactly the same thing in reverse. That symmetry is probably one of the smartest aspects of the screenplay. Nobody fully sees each other anymore. They see assumptions, histories, trauma, symbols. Humans look at intelligent apes carrying weapons and imagine the extinction of mankind. The apes look at humans and remember laboratories, cages, and cruelty. Both groups are reacting more to memory than present reality. And honestly, that's where the film starts feeling less like traditional science fiction and more like historical allegory. There are moments where you can almost map real-world conflicts directly onto what's happening on-screen: territorial disputes, nationalism, colonial anxiety, radicalization, cycles of retaliation. The film never confines itself to one rigid political metaphor specifically, which actually strengthens it. Different viewers can project entirely different real-world parallels onto the story depending on their own perspective. Some interpret it as racial allegory, others see reflections of war politics, some connect it to ideological extremism, others see debates surrounding land, coexistence, and inherited violence. And strangely enough, all of those interpretations function. What's especially effective is how gradually the film depicts prejudice developing. Nobody wakes up one morning suddenly demanding war. It begins smaller than that: distrust. Rumors, defensive behavior, refusal to empathize. The moment one side stops believing the other side is capable of peace, the relationship itself begins collapsing. And honestly, Dawn becomes remarkably bleak about how quickly societies can fall into tribal thinking once survival enters the equation. People instinctively begin prioritizing us over them. Compassion contracts, fear expands. Suddenly, every action becomes interpreted through suspicion. The frightening part is how recognizable all of that feels. There's also this recurring tension surrounding territory that adds another layer to the film's exploration of prejudice. Humans need the dam because they're trying to survive, but the apes now view the forest as their home. And depending on your perspective, both claims feel emotionally legitimate. That's why audiences often leave the film divided. Some instinctively align with humanity because survival becomes the priority. Others identify more closely with the apes because the apes resemble an oppressed group finally defending autonomy from a species that historically abused them. The film never fully resolves that argument either. It simply allows the tension to exist, and I think that ambiguity matters because it quietly forces viewers to confront their own biases. You begin asking uncomfortable questions. At what point does self-defense become aggression? At what point does fear become prejudice? How much violence can trauma justify before the victim begins resembling the oppressor? The film keeps nudging those ideas forward without ever turning itself into a lecture. What I also find fascinating is how quickly ape civilization begins repeating human social behavior once fear enters the system. Caesar wants coexistence. But the moment survival feels threatened, many apes immediately gravitate toward harsher leadership and simpler answers. Koba's rhetoric becomes appealing because fear makes certainty attractive, and honestly, that feels painfully realistic. Fear rarely makes societies wiser. It makes societies more reactive. And Dawn of the Planet of the Apes understands that tribalism often grows strongest during periods of uncertainty. The more unstable the world becomes, the more people crave identity, unity, and enemies they can blame for their suffering. Humans do it, apes do it, civilizations do it. That's the tragic cycle the film keeps returning to. Even the phrase ape not kill ape becomes increasingly fascinating the longer you think about it. On the surface, it functions as a moral law designed to hold ape society together. But underneath that principle, there's already an implied division forming, apes versus everyone else. Once a civilization defines itself strongly enough against an outside group, aggression becomes much easier to rationalize. And Dawn quietly understands how dangerous that mindset can eventually become. What gives the film so much emotional weight is that it never suggests hatred is entirely irrational. That's what separates it from simplistic war is bad storytelling. Humans have legitimate reasons to fear extinction. The apes have legitimate reasons to distrust humanity. Nobody's trauma is imaginary. But instead of healing that trauma, both societies gradually organize themselves around it. That's where tribalism wins. By the end, the film almost starts feeling like a warning about how civilizations pass fear from one generation to the next. The apes evolved intellectually, but emotionally they absorbed humanity's worst instincts alongside its intelligence: prejudice, pride, fear of the unfamiliar, and the desire to protect one's own group at any cost. And once those instincts begin dominating a society, peace becomes incredibly fragile. That's why Dawn of the Planet of the Apes lingers in your mind long after it ends. Beneath all the motion capture technology and large-scale spectacle, it's ultimately a story about how easily intelligent societies can convince themselves that coexistence is impossible, especially once fear starts sounding more persuasive than empathy. What I genuinely admire about the film is that it trusts the audience enough to engage with larger philosophical and political ideas without constantly stopping to explain itself. Dawn absolutely works as blockbuster entertainment. You can experience it purely for the tension, the visual effects, the action sequences, all of that. But beneath the surface, there's a surprisingly thoughtful ideological layer running through almost every scene. And importantly, the movie never aggressively announces how important its themes are. That restraint helps tremendously, because honestly, some science fiction films become so consumed with delivering a message that they stop functioning as stories. Dawn avoids that trap most of the time. It allows its allegory to emerge naturally through leadership, fear, social division, and conflict, rather than relying on oversized speeches spelling everything out for the audience. The clearest example of that is obviously the relationship between Caesar and Koba. They aren't simply opposing personalities. They represent two completely different political responses to trauma. Caesar believes survival depends on restraint, cooperation, and coexistence, even after everything humans inflicted upon the apes. Koba believes suffering teaches the opposite lesson entirely, that power is the only thing preventing oppression. And the unsettling part is that history contains evidence supporting both perspectives. That's what makes their conflict feel larger than a conventional hero versus villain dynamic. It begins feeling ideological, historical, even. You can map countless real-world political tensions onto their relationship without the film forcing one rigid interpretation onto the audience. Some viewers see revolutionary politics in it, others see nationalism. Cycles of retaliation, extremism versus diplomacy, historical oppression giving birth to radicalization. And honestly, all of those readings feel valid. The film repeatedly returns to this deeply uncomfortable idea that societies built around fear eventually start producing more fear. Once survival becomes the primary concern, morality contracts rapidly. Leaders stop asking what is right and begin asking what is necessary. That becomes the emotional landscape of the entire movie. Caesar spends most of the story trying to preserve principles while the world around him increasingly demands harsher solutions. Koba rejects those principles altogether, because he views them as vulnerabilities that will eventually get the apes destroyed. And again, the film never fully dismisses him. That matters enormously. Koba's ideology is dangerous, absolutely, but it didn't emerge in isolation. Human cruelty created him. In a strange way, he becomes the political consequence of oppression, left unresolved. The abused eventually stop believing coexistence is possible and begin viewing domination as the only reliable path towards safety. That's not merely a science fiction concept. History repeats that pattern constantly. What's also fascinating is how rapidly ape civilization begins reproducing human political behavior the moment organized society takes shape. Leadership struggles emerge, internal division develops, fear-driven rhetoric spreads, militarization intensifies, public manipulation appears, questions of loyalty and identity become central. The apes inherit humanity's intelligence, but they also inherit humanity's social instincts, including the destructive ones. That realization gives the film a surprisingly pessimistic philosophical edge. Early on, it almost feels as though the apes might become a morally superior civilization. They're more communal, more connected to nature, less corrupted by industrial collapse and historical greed. But gradually, the film dismantles that fantasy. Intelligence alone does not eliminate violence. Evolution does not erase tribalism. Civilization does not automatically create wisdom. If anything, Dawn occasionally feels like it's arguing the opposite. The more organized societies become, the more sophisticated their conflicts become as well. And honestly, there's something deeply bleak about that idea. The movie also keeps quietly asking what humanity actually means, which is ironic considering much of the emotional depth comes from characters who technically aren't human at all. Caesar often behaves with more compassion, emotional intelligence, and moral reflection than many surviving humans. Meanwhile, Koba embodies some of the darkest aspects of human history, despite not being biologically human himself. So where exactly is the dividing line? Is humanity biological, emotional, philosophical? Is it empathy, violence, consciousness, the ability to organize civilization, or the ability to destroy it? The film never offers a definitive answer because it doesn't really have one. Instead, it keeps blurring the distinction between species until the real divide becomes ideological rather than biological. That's why the conflict works so effectively. This isn't really humans versus apes. It's fear versus empathy, revenge versus coexistence, control versus trust, and every character exists somewhere within those tensions. There's also this powerful undercurrent surrounding leadership throughout the film that I think people sometimes overlook. Caesar and Dreyfus are both leaders attempting to protect their people under nearly impossible circumstances, but the methods they choose gradually begin shaping the future of their societies. Meanwhile, Koba rises specifically because fear makes aggressive certainty attractive. And honestly, that feels painfully realistic politically. People gravitate toward harsher voices when they feel threatened. The film understands that extremist leadership rarely emerges during stability. The ape community genuinely feels populated by individuals rather than background digital creations. And honestly, that's probably the greatest achievement of the performances overall: individuality. The film never allows the apes to blur together emotionally. You remember them. You recognize them immediately. You understand their personalities almost instinctively. That's difficult enough in live-action ensemble films, let alone in a movie where most of the central cast exists through motion capture technology. I also think the performances elevate scenes that could have felt absurd on paper. If the acting had been even slightly weaker, some of the more emotionally serious moments probably would have collapsed instantly. A film asking audiences to emotionally invest in political tensions between hyperintelligent apes and surviving humans is walking an incredibly delicate tonal line, but the actors commit completely. Nobody is winking at the audience. Nobody treats the material ironically or as camp. The performances remain emotionally sincere, and because of that sincerity, the film earns emotional investment it probably shouldn't logically be able to achieve. And honestly, one of the strangest things about Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is that by the end, you're often more emotionally attached to the digitally rendered apes than many of the actual human characters. That isn't just visual effects. That's performance. I think one of the smartest creative decisions the film made was bringing in Matt Reeves as director, because in someone else's hands, this could have very easily become a louder, emptier sequel. You can actually feel Reeves resisting that temptation throughout the entire movie. A lot of directors, especially after a successful first film and with a significantly larger budget available, would have leaned heavily into non-stop spectacle. Bigger explosions, faster pacing, constant chaos. More overt, look how epic this is energy. Reeves goes quieter than that much of the time, not slow exactly, patient. And honestly, patience is probably the defining quality of his direction here. He allows scenes room to breathe in ways modern blockbusters rarely do anymore. Conversations aren't constantly interrupted by aggressive music cues or frantic editing. The camera lingers on reactions. Silence is allowed to exist. There are entire stretches where tension emerges purely from uncertainty rather than action itself. That confidence matters enormously because the emotional atmosphere of the film depends heavily on restraint. Reeves understands this story only works if audiences genuinely believe conflict can still be avoided for most of the runtime. So instead of directing every interaction like open war is already happening, he builds this constant low-level unease beneath everything. You're always waiting for something to emotionally collapse, and when violence finally erupts, it feels earned because of how carefully Reeves constructs the build-up beforehand. What I especially appreciate is that Reeves directs the apes as actual dramatic characters rather than visual effects showcases. That sounds obvious, but honestly a lesser director probably would have focused almost entirely on the novelty of intelligent talking apes. Reeves treats them with the same seriousness he would human actors. That's probably the best way to describe the overall emotional atmosphere of the score. It doesn't sound like civilization fighting to win. It sounds like civilization struggling not to collapse entirely. There's exhaustion embedded in the music, and Giacchino is remarkably smart about when not to use music too. Some of the film's strongest scenes rely heavily on silence or minimal sound, because Reeves understands emotional tension becomes stronger when every moment isn't overwhelmed by orchestral intensity. There are conversations between Caesar and Malcolm where the quiet itself becomes uncomfortable. You hear breathing, movement, environmental texture, tiny pauses in dialogue. That silence matters. Because when the score finally expands later, during moments of violence or emotional collapse, it actually feels earned instead of manipulative. I also really appreciate how the music never turns the apes into generic fantasy heroes. That would have been the easy approach. Huge triumphant warrior themes every time Caesar appears, but the score remains emotionally conflicted most of the time, just like the story itself. Even during the larger battle sequences, there's still melancholy woven through the music. The film rarely treats war as victory. Giacchino's score understands these action scenes are tragedies unfolding, not celebrations. That emotional awareness elevates a huge number of scenes. There's one thing the soundtrack does especially well, building dread gradually. Certain musical cues almost feel less like themes and more like warnings. You can hear tension tightening underneath conversations long before the characters openly acknowledge how dangerous the situation has become. The score keeps quietly whispering, "This is not going to end well." And honestly, some of the best musical moments in the film aren't even the loud ones. It's the quieter emotional material surrounding Caesar and ape civilization that stays with me the most. The music connected to Caesar often feels reflective, almost burdened. There's wisdom inside it, but also sadness and isolation, which makes perfect sense because Caesar himself carries the emotional weight of the entire movie. Now, when the score does become larger and more aggressive, Giacchino absolutely delivers scale. The battle sequences sound massive without collapsing into generic blockbuster percussion overload. You still feel texture inside the music, anger, momentum, panic, emotional collapse, but it never becomes so overpowering that it disconnects from the emotional reality of the scene. That balance is incredibly difficult. Because Dawn walks this strange tonal line where it needs to feel epic while still remaining grounded and tragic. Too much heroic energy, and the film loses emotional complexity. Too little energy, and the action loses impact entirely. The soundtrack threads that needle remarkably well. The sound design deserves enormous credit too, especially regarding the apes themselves. The movie pays extraordinary attention to vocal texture and physical sound. Grunts, breathing, movement through trees, subtle shifts in body language, all of it helps sell the apes as living beings rather than animated effects. Even small details matter. The way Caesar's voice carries authority without sounding fully human, the aggression embedded inside Koba's vocal delivery, the quieter communication between apes that feels instinctual rather than theatrical. The sound team clearly understood the apes needed to exist within this strange middle ground between animal and human. And honestly, that audio work becomes part of why the performances feel emotionally believable. The environmental sound design is excellent too. The ruined world constantly feels alive in subtle ways, wind moving through abandoned buildings, rain hitting metal surfaces, distant echoes inside empty spaces, forest ambience surrounding ape civilization. The film creates this deeply immersive sense of place where the environment itself contributes emotionally to scenes. Nothing sounds overly polished. That's important. The world feels rough and weathered acoustically, which perfectly complements the visual atmosphere surrounding it. Human spaces sound hollow and exhausted. Ape environments sound organic and alive. Even subconsciously, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes keeps reinforcing the divide between collapsing human civilization and emerging ape society through sound design alone. And honestly, one of the smartest creative choices the film makes is not overwhelming every scene with constant noise. A lot of blockbuster sound mixes today become exhausting because everything is pushed to maximum intensity all the time. Dawn actually allows dynamic range. Quiet scenes are allowed to remain quiet. Emotional moments are given space to breathe. Then when violence finally erupts, the sudden explosion of sound feels genuinely overwhelming because the movie hasn't spent 2 straight hours screaming at the audience already. That control makes the action hit significantly harder. There's also this haunting quality, woven through parts of the soundtrack, that really stayed with me revisiting the film. Certain musical themes almost feel ancient, like the score itself is mourning one civilization while quietly observing another rise from its ashes. That emotional duality fits the movie perfectly. Because beneath all the conflict and spectacle, Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is ultimately an extremely sad story. And honestly, the music may understand that sadness better than anything else in the film. It doesn't score the apocalypse like an adventure. It scores it like a funeral that never fully ended. What I find especially interesting about the action in Dawn is that the movie spends so much time trying to avoid violence that once violence finally erupts, it feels unsettling instead of purely exhilarating. That completely changes the emotional tone of the action sequences. A lot of blockbusters build toward combat as though it's the audience's reward: bigger explosions, louder destruction, larger battles. Dawn absolutely contains spectacle, and honestly some of that spectacle is incredible. But underneath it there's always this lingering feeling that something meaningful is being destroyed every time the conflict escalates. The movie treats war as failure more than victory, and I think that's why the action stays memorable. Even early in the film, before the larger battles begin, Reeves stages tension almost like action itself. The first major confrontation between humans and apes in the forest isn't enormous in terms of explosions or choreography, but the atmosphere is so unstable and fragile that it becomes gripping immediately. You're constantly waiting for someone to panic, for someone to misread the situation, for everything to collapse. And when Caesar rides into the human settlement with the apes behind him, honestly, that scene still feels incredibly powerful. Not because it's flashy exactly, but because of the sheer presence of it. The horses, the silence, the way the apes move together like a military force humanity suddenly realizes it completely underestimated. Matt Reeves stages the sequence with so much controlled tension that it feels mythic without becoming unintentionally absurd. And that balance is incredibly difficult when you're directing armed apes on horseback while still trying to maintain emotional seriousness. But the movie commits completely, and honestly, once the war fully begins, some of the imagery becomes unforgettable. Koba riding through battle firing machine guns, while apes charge through collapsing human defenses sounds ridiculous if you casually describe it out loud. Yet inside the film, it somehow works because the emotional groundwork underneath the conflict is already so strong. The action feels like ideology physically exploding into reality. That's the crucial difference. The battles don't feel like random set pieces inserted because audiences expect action every 20 minutes. Every major confrontation grows naturally from fear, revenge, political collapse, trauma, and escalating mistrust. So even when the visuals become enormous, the sequences still feel emotionally connected to the story itself. I also really appreciate how clearly Reeves stages everything. Modern blockbuster action often becomes nearly impossible to follow: frantic cutting, shaky cameras, visual overload everywhere. Dawn mostly avoids that problem entirely. Even during large-scale chaotic battles, you understand geography and momentum. You know where characters are. You understand who's advancing and who's emotionally collapsing. That clarity matters enormously, especially during the nighttime battle sequences, which honestly could have very easily dissolved into incomprehensible CGI chaos. Instead, Reeves uses firelight, darkness, smoke, and movement in ways that keep the action visually coherent while still allowing it to feel overwhelming. There's a sequence involving tanks, mounted apes, collapsing structures, gunfire everywhere, and somehow it still maintains emotional focus instead of collapsing into pure noise. That's genuinely strong direction. What also helps is that the action has physicality. The apes move differently from humans, and the movie fully embraces that during combat. They climb, leap, swing, and move through environments with this raw animal energy that makes the battles feel distinct from standard military action scenes. The combat feels unpredictable because the apes don't behave like ordinary soldiers. And honestly, the movie understands scale remarkably well too. Sometimes the conflict feels intimate and brutal, emotional betrayals, desperate survival, close-quarter struggles. Other times it suddenly expands into almost apocalyptic warfare imagery, where it feels like civilization itself is collapsing in real time. But even at its largest, the action rarely feels emotionally empty. That's probably because the film constantly reminds you what's being lost beneath the spectacle. Every battle represents another step away from coexistence. Every escalation pushes Caesar's dream further out of reach. So there's always sadness woven into the excitement. Even the film's most visually thrilling moments carry emotional heaviness underneath them. You're impressed by the scale, but you're also watching characters destroy whatever fragile hope remained between species. And honestly, I think that emotional tension makes the action stronger than much of modern franchise filmmaking, because the movie isn't trying to create cool war moments in isolation. It's depicting society's unraveling under pressure. The spectacle carries consequences. The violence changes people. Characters become harder, angrier, and more isolated as the conflict intensifies. Kober especially transforms the emotional atmosphere of the action once he fully embraces war. The battles stop feeling defensive and begin feeling ideological. His aggression infects the entire ape civilization. Suddenly, the action becomes harsher, faster, and more chaotic because the emotional center holding things together, Caesar's restraint, begins collapsing. You can actually feel the movie darkening as Koba gains control. And what's really interesting is that Dawn rarely frames violence as empowering for very long. There are moments of dominance, certainly, moments where characters temporarily seize control through force, but the emotional aftermath always feels grim. Nobody truly wins anything meaningful once the war fully begins. That's why the climax works emotionally, even if certain plot mechanics become somewhat predictable structurally. The final confrontations aren't satisfying in a conventional triumphant blockbuster way. They feel tragic, exhausting, like inevitability finally arriving. Even Caesar's victories carry emotional devastation, because by that point, he understands the damage can't truly be undone anymore. The piece he wanted is already gone. And honestly, that's probably why the action in Dawn of the Planet of the Apes ages better than many CGI-heavy blockbusters from the same era. The spectacle serves character and theme rather than replacing them. Underneath all the fire, gunfire, collapsing towers, horses, and ape warfare, the film is still fundamentally about fear destroying the possibility of understanding. The battles simply become the physical shape that fear eventually takes. One thing that really separates Dawn of the Planet of the Apes from a lot of modern blockbusters is its tone. This movie is heavy. Not simply emotionally sad during certain scenes. I mean, the entire film feels weighed down by this constant atmosphere of dread and exhaustion from beginning to end. Even before the first major conflict arrives, the world already feels wounded somehow. And honestly, I completely understand why some people deeply admire that about the movie and why others struggle with it. Because Dawn is not trying to function as a carefree roller coaster experience most of the time. There's very little emotional relief here, very little lightness. The film commits fully to this bleak, tense emotional space where every interaction feels as though it could become catastrophic if someone loses control for even a moment. Matt Reeves keeps the pressure simmering almost constantly. You can feel it in the pacing too. The movie moves deliberately, sometimes almost uncomfortably deliberately. It spends time sitting inside conversations, awkward silences, suspicious glances, hesitant negotiations. The film understands emotional tension can matter just as much as physical action, so it's willing to slow down and allow scenes to breathe instead of constantly sprinting toward the next spectacle sequence. And personally, I think that patience helps the movie tremendously, because the slower pacing allows the world to feel emotionally lived in. You spend enough time with both the apes and the humans to fully understand the fear hanging over each group. The film wants the audience to exist inside the discomfort of coexistence, rather than rushing immediately toward warfare. At the same time, though, I do think the movie occasionally risks becoming too weighed down by its own seriousness. There are stretches where every line, every stare, every scene feels intensely aware that it belongs inside a major science fiction drama. And after a while, that emotional density can become slightly exhausting. the movie rarely relaxes. Even quieter scenes carry this lingering sense that catastrophe is approaching. That creates incredible tension, but it can also make the pacing feel ponderous for certain viewers, especially audiences expecting a more traditional action-driven blockbuster experience. Dawn spends a surprising amount of runtime exploring mistrust, leadership, politics, and emotional fallout before fully unleashing the large-scale conflict. And honestly, I admire that choice far more than I dislike it. Because the emotional heaviness is exactly what gives the later collapse into violence its impact. If the film treated everything casually, the war wouldn't feel nearly as tragic. The weight is part of the point. Reeves wants the audience to feel the burden these characters are carrying, especially Caesar. The entire movie almost feels emotionally filtered through Caesar's exhaustion. He's trying to hold together a civilization while watching fear spread through both species simultaneously, and the pacing constantly reflects that pressure. Nothing feels stable, nothing feels easy. Even hopeful moments carry uncertainty underneath them. That uncertainty exists everywhere in the film. You never fully settle into comfort because the movie never allows you to forget how fragile peace actually is. Every time tensions begin calming down, there's another reminder that mistrust is still quietly expanding beneath the surface. And honestly, after a while that atmosphere becomes strangely immersive. The film doesn't feel constructed around moments in the typical blockbuster sense. It feels more like emotional pressure gradually building until collapse becomes unavoidable. The pacing reflects escalation rather than excitement. Small tensions accumulate, tiny misunderstandings deepen, suspicion spreads slowly. It's less "here comes the big battle" and more "here comes the emotional breakdown nobody knows how to stop." That's a very different rhythm from most franchise filmmaking. I also think the lack of forced humor strengthens the tone enormously. Modern blockbusters frequently undercut their own emotional scenes because they seem terrified of sincerity lasting too long. Someone cracks a joke during tension. Dramatic moments get interrupted by sarcasm. Emotional atmosphere constantly resets every few minutes. Dawn doesn't really do that. When scenes become uncomfortable, the film allows them to remain uncomfortable. When characters are grieving or afraid, Reeves lets the silence and emotional tension stay intact instead of immediately softening everything with comic relief. That commitment gives the movie emotional credibility. Now, does the seriousness occasionally become excessive? Honestly, yes. There are moments where the film feels almost burdened by how intensely it wants to be viewed as thoughtful science fiction. Certain scenes carry so much symbolic weight that they lose a little naturalism. People don't always speak like this under pressure. Not every interaction needs to feel metaphorical. And there are definitely stretches where a little more emotional variation or looseness might have helped the pacing breathe more naturally. But at the same time, I'd still rather watch a blockbuster, willing to risk becoming overly serious, than one that immediately jokes away every emotional moment. At least Dawn feels sincere, and honestly, sincerity has become surprisingly rare in franchise filmmaking. The emotional weight also works because the film never really offers easy optimism. Even before the ending arrives, there's this lingering sense that the characters are trying to stop something larger than themselves while slowly realizing they probably can't. That inevitability hangs over the pacing constantly. You aren't watching heroes confidently march toward victory. You're watching civilizations drift toward collapse, while a few exhausted individuals desperately try to slow the process down. That sadness becomes part of the film's identity. Even the action scenes carry emotional fatigue underneath them. The war never feels triumphant. It feels tragic and inevitable. The pacing slows enough beforehand that when violence finally explodes, you feel the emotional cost, rather than simply enjoying spectacle in isolation. And honestly, I think that emotional heaviness is one of the main reasons the film stayed with audiences. Not because it's relentlessly entertaining in the traditional popcorn blockbuster sense. Sometimes it's actually emotionally oppressive, but that oppressive atmosphere gives the story weight. It makes the world feel real enough that the collapse of trust genuinely hurts. By the end, the movie almost feels like a slow-motion tragedy disguised as a summer blockbuster. Everything is moving toward destruction from the very beginning. The characters simply don't fully realize it yet. One of the most fascinating things about Dawn of the Planet of the Apes is how differently people respond to it morally. Seriously, I've seen conversations about this film where two viewers walk away with completely opposite emotional reactions while watching the exact same scenes. And honestly, I think the movie becomes stronger because of that. Because it never fully tells you who you're supposed to support. At first glance, it almost feels obvious. The apes are more emotionally sympathetic, Audiences already spent the previous film watching Caesar suffer under human cruelty, so naturally viewers arrive with emotional investment in the ape perspective. Humans created the virus. Humans abused the apes. Humans destroyed civilization. So initially it's easy to view the ape community as the moral center of the story, but then the movie starts complicating everything. The humans aren't trying to enter the forest because they're cartoonishly evil conquerors. They're trying to survive. Their civilization is collapsing. They need power, communication, stability. From their perspective, they're facing extinction too. And suddenly, the moral boundaries start becoming blurry very quickly. I remember talking to people after watching Dawn of the Planet of the Apes who completely sided with Caesar and the apes, viewing the humans almost like colonizers returning to threaten a society that had finally achieved freedom. Then other people argued the exact opposite, that humanity's survival has to come first because, ultimately, they're human beings trying not to disappear entirely. And honestly, both interpretations make emotional sense. That's what makes the movie so compelling, because the conflict isn't built around easy morality. It's built around competing fears and survival instincts. Depending on which emotional perspective you connect to most strongly, your interpretation of the story changes completely. Some viewers watch the film and see a tragedy about oppressed beings defending themselves against a species with a long history of domination and cruelty. Other viewers see humanity desperately trying to preserve the final remnants of civilization, while increasingly intelligent apes become an existential threat. The movie intentionally leaves room for both readings, and honestly, that ambiguity creates some genuinely uncomfortable self-reflection too, because while watching, you start noticing your own instinctive biases. Are you siding with humans automatically because they're your species? Are you siding with the apes because the film emotionally frames them more sympathetically? Are you prioritizing survival over coexistence, justice over peace? The movie quietly pushes those questions onto the audience without directly announcing them. That's smart writing. And interestingly, the film itself almost feels emotionally conflicted too. There are scenes where it very clearly wants you to empathize deeply with Caesar and the apes, especially considering their history of suffering. But then it also repeatedly reminds you how terrifying this situation looks from the human perspective. Imagine being one of the survivors inside San Francisco. Humanity already lost billions of lives. Society collapsed. Infrastructure barely functions anymore. And now there's an organized civilization of intelligent apes nearby, carrying weapons, riding horses, communicating strategically, becoming stronger every year. Of course, humans are afraid. That fear feels rational. At the same time, from Caesar's perspective, humans represent the species that enslaved, experimented on, abused, and ultimately destroyed the world through its own arrogance. So when humans begin entering ape territory again, the apes immediately fear history repeating itself. And honestly, that fear feels rational too. That's why the movie lingers emotionally with audiences. It refuses to simplify fear into easy good versus evil morality. Fear becomes understandable on both sides, which makes the conflict feel tragic rather than emotionally satisfying. The audience ends up divided for the same reason the characters themselves are divided. Nobody fully trusts the other side enough to lower their guard. And I think Koba's role especially pushes viewers into deeply uncomfortable territory morally, because while most people recognize he eventually becomes dangerous, the film never allows you to forget why he became that way. His hatred isn't abstract prejudice. It comes directly from trauma and abuse. So even while condemning his actions, audiences still understand the emotional roots underneath them. That complexity matters enormously. Because the movie isn't really asking whether violence is justified in some simplistic sense. It's asking how trauma reshapes morality itself. At what point does survival instinct become cruelty? At what point does self-defense become extremism? Different viewers answer those questions differently depending on their own experiences and beliefs. And that's part of why discussions surrounding Dawn remain interesting years later. Honestly, I also think the film's moral ambiguity benefits greatly from not portraying humanity as entirely incompetent or irredeemable. Malcolm exists specifically to complicate the narrative. Caesar sees goodness in Malcolm because Malcolm reminds him compassion still survives somewhere within humanity. Without Malcolm, the movie probably becomes emotionally one-sided. But with him present, the conflict remains painful because peace actually feels possible for a while. And that's where the emotional divide among viewers becomes strongest. Some people watch the movie and leave believing coexistence genuinely could have worked if extremists hadn't destroyed it. Others believe conflict was inevitable from the beginning because survival pressure eventually overwhelms idealism. Honestly, I'm not even sure the film itself fully answers that question. There's this lingering uncertainty hanging over the entire story about whether intelligent societies are truly capable of overcoming fear once survival begins feeling threatened. The apes inherit humanity's intelligence, but they also inherit humanity's paranoia, tribalism, and desire for control. That realization changes how different audiences interpret the ending too. Some people see Caesar's final acceptance of war as tragic necessity. Others interpret it as proof that civilization itself inevitably corrupts idealism. Some view the apes as humanity's replacement. Others see them as humanity repeating itself under a different species entirely. And strangely enough, the movie supports all of those interpretations at least partially. That openness is probably one of its greatest strengths. Because Dawn of the Planet of the Apes doesn't really leave audiences debating who won the war. It leaves them debating whether either side was ever truly capable of escaping it in the first place. What's honestly kind of remarkable about Dawn is that if you told people back in the early 2000s that one of the smartest blockbuster trilogies of the modern era would eventually come from the Planet of the Apes franchise, a lot of people probably would have laughed at you. Because before Rise of the Planet of the Apes and Dawn, the franchise had a very strange reputation for years. The original 1968 film is obviously iconic. That movie secured its place in science fiction history decades ago. The imagery, the social commentary, Charlton Heston screaming on the beach, all of it became permanently embedded in film culture. Even people who have never actually watched the movie usually recognize references to it somehow. But the franchise itself, that's a much more uneven story. The older sequels absolutely had imagination and ambition, but they also became increasingly strange and inconsistent as the series progressed. Then Planet of the Apes happened in 2001, and honestly, that version mostly left audiences confused more than anything else. Visually interesting at times perhaps, but emotionally hollow. It felt like a franchise people respected historically rather than actively cared about anymore. So when Rise was announced, expectations weren't exactly enormous. And honestly, that's part of why the reboot trilogy surprised people so much. Rise succeeded because it treated Caesar seriously as a character, rather than relying entirely on nostalgia for the earlier films. Then Dawn arrived and expanded everything in a way that felt significantly more ambitious than most franchise sequels usually do. What I especially appreciate about Dawn is that it respects the original franchise themes without becoming trapped by them. The film clearly understands what made the older Planet of the Apes movies resonate: social allegory, fear of societal collapse, political tension, distrust between civilizations, questions surrounding humanity itself. Those ideas are woven directly into the DNA of the reboot trilogy, but Dawn modernizes them instead of simply imitating them. The older films often approach their themes in broader, more theatrical ways. Dawn feels more psychologically intimate and emotionally grounded. The conflict isn't merely symbolic, it feels personal. You understand the trauma shaping both sides in ways the older films sometimes approached more abstractly. And honestly, I think the reboot trilogy benefited enormously from centering itself so heavily around Caesar. That was probably the smartest creative decision the filmmakers could have made. Because instead of constantly chasing the shadow of Charlton Heston's original protagonist from Planet of the Apes, the newer films built an entirely different emotional foundation of their own. Caesar becomes the bridge connecting the franchise's philosophical ideas to genuine emotional investment. Without him, these movies probably don't function nearly as well. What's interesting too is how Dawn of the Planet of the Apes exists somewhere between old-school science fiction and modern blockbuster filmmaking. You can still feel traces of classic dystopian storytelling throughout it: political allegory, societal collapse, ideological conflict, but it's presented through contemporary pacing, visual effects, and emotional realism. The movie isn't trying to recreate the exact tone of the 1960s films, because honestly, that approach probably wouldn't fully connect with modern audiences anyway. Instead, Matt Reeves takes the spirit of those earlier stories and filters them through a darker, more grounded lens. And you can absolutely feel echoes of other narratives moving through Dawn as well. Some people compare Caesar and Koba to Professor X and Magneto, which honestly isn't entirely inaccurate. There's definitely that same ideological divide between peaceful coexistence and aggressive resistance. You can also feel shades of Animal Farm in the political evolution of ape society. The revolution slowly risks reproducing the same systems of fear and power it originally rose against. Even certain war film influences quietly emerge throughout the movie, but the film never feels like it's lazily borrowing ideas. It absorbs those influences into the larger Planet of the Apes mythology naturally enough that the movie still feels entirely like its own thing. And honestly, one reason Dawn stands out so strongly within the franchise is because it's probably the moment where the reboot series fully realized what it wanted to become tonally. Rise of the Planet of the Apes still contained traces of blockbuster, crowd-pleasing energy mixed into the drama. Dawn becomes much colder and emotionally heavier, more political, more tragic. Less interested in simple entertainment and more interested in moral ambiguity, societal collapse, and the emotional consequences of fear. That tonal shift worked for some viewers more than others. There are definitely fans of the older films who still prefer the practical makeup effects and surreal atmosphere of the original series. And honestly, I completely understand that. There's a tactile strangeness to the classic films that CGI-heavy modern filmmaking can't truly replicate. The older movies feel handmade in this fascinating, almost mythic way. But at the same time, the newer trilogy accomplished something the originals simply couldn't technologically achieve: deeply nuanced emotional performances from ape characters. The motion capture performances allow Caesar and the others to carry emotional subtlety that older effects techniques would never have been capable of delivering. So in a strange way, both eras of the franchise excel at different things. The originals feel more satirical and mythic. The reboot trilogy feels more psychologically grounded and emotionally immersive. And honestly, I think Dawn is probably the film where the reboot series finally proved it wasn't surviving purely on franchise recognition anymore. People stopped saying, "This is surprisingly good for a Planet of the Apes movie." They started saying, "This is one of the better science fiction blockbusters of its decade." That's an enormous difference. What also helps is that Dawn doesn't constantly overload itself with fan service references. There are subtle nods to the older films here and there if you know the franchise history, but Reeves never allows callbacks to become the central attraction. The story still functions perfectly well even for someone who has never watched the original movies. That independence matters, because a lot of legacy franchises become so obsessed with nostalgia that they stop functioning as actual stories. Dawn avoids that trap by focusing on emotional and thematic continuity rather than surface-level references. And honestly, looking back now, it's kind of impressive how seriously this trilogy took itself during a period when many blockbuster franchises were leaning heavily into irony and self-awareness. The Planet of the Apes reboot films committed fully to sincerity. No mocking the premise, no apologizing for the emotional weight, no constant meta-humor reminding audiences that everything is just entertainment. The films trusted viewers enough to engage seriously with intelligent apes, political allegory, societal collapse, and tragedy. And somehow it worked. That's probably why Dawn of the Planet of the Apes became more than simply a strong sequel. It became the moment this franchise fully earned its modern identity. Looking back on Dawn now, I honestly think what impresses me most is that the movie genuinely tried to become more than audiences expected from it. And somehow, against all odds, it mostly succeeded. Because on paper, this really should not have worked nearly as well as it does. A massive summer blockbuster about motion-captured apes battling human survivors across a ruined San Francisco sounds exactly like the kind of project that could have very easily collapsed into empty spectacle or accidental absurdity in the wrong hands. Instead, Dawn became this strangely thoughtful, emotionally heavy science fiction drama that also happens to contain apes riding horses into battle carrying machine guns. That combination honestly should not feel coherent. But somehow it does. Not perfectly, obviously. The movie absolutely has flaws. Some of the human characters remain underdeveloped. Certain plot mechanics rely a little too heavily on convenient escalation. The pacing occasionally becomes overly solemn and weighed down by its own seriousness. And if someone never emotionally connects with the CGI performances, I can completely understand why portions of the film might leave them emotionally distant. But even with those weaknesses, the movie lingers. That's the thing. A lot of technically polished blockbusters disappear from your memory almost immediately after the credits end. You enjoy them for 2 hours, maybe discuss a visually impressive action scene for a day or two, and then they evaporate because there's nothing emotionally or intellectually supporting the spectacle underneath. Dawn stays with you. Partly because Caesar is such a powerful emotional center, partly because the movie's themes surrounding fear, tribalism, coexistence, and leadership still feel painfully relevant. But mostly because the film treats its own ideas with sincerity. It fully commits to the emotional reality of its world, instead of hiding behind irony or constantly apologizing for its premise. That sincerity gives the movie weight. And honestly, I think time has been very kind to it because of that. Revisiting it now, the film actually feels more mature than a lot of modern franchise filmmaking. Not necessarily because it's flawless, but because it's willing to remain inside uncomfortable emotional territory for extended stretches without rushing to soften everything with humor or empty spectacle. The movie trusts silence. It trusts tension. It trusts ambiguity. And honestly, that's becoming surprisingly rare. I also think Dawn benefited enormously from arriving before audiences became completely exhausted by cinematic universes and formula-driven blockbuster storytelling. The film still feels handcrafted in a certain way, personal, even. You can feel Reeves trying to make an actual tragedy rather than simply delivering the next franchise installment. And because of that, the movie has personality. A gloomy personality, definitely, sometimes almost oppressively gloomy, but personality nonetheless. The atmosphere alone gives it a distinct identity. That damp, overgrown, emotionally exhausted world still looks fantastic years later.